I'm thrilled that we're joined by Elizabeth Kolbert. Elizabeth Kolbert has been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 1999. She's the editor of The Best American Science and Nature Writing, 2009, and among other books, is the author of Field Notes from a Catastrophe and The Sixth Extinction, for which she won the Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction in 2015. Her latest book is H for Hope. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Kolbert.
Hi, everyone. While we just changed the setup here, I just want to say good morning, and it's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. I am a child of the Bronx. I grew up my first several years in the Bronx and visited the New York Botanical Gardens many times, and then my own kids grew up partly in Westchester, and we spent more time than I really care to remember in front of the trains exhibit. So I'm a big fan of the Botanical Gardens, and it's a pleasure to be here. This is a celebration this morning. I'm going to begin with a bit of a caveat. I spend my time writing about environmental issues, which is these days coterminous, really, with environmental problems. So this is not a lot of this talk is celebratory, but as they say on the radio, stay with us. So I'm going to begin this morning at quite a distance from New York. This is Greenland, a shot of Greenland, taken from a very small plane, which I had a 6-seat plane, which I had the privilege to be on pretty recently, maybe a couple, 6 or 7 weeks ago. Back in July, I spent 2 weeks reporting on a reporting trip to Greenland. And as you all probably know, Greenland's a bit bigger than Alaska. The map projection often makes it look even bigger. And it has a population of about 55,000 people. So the population density of Manhattan, which I looked up recently, is roughly 70,000 people per square mile. So all of Greenland has, fewer residents than 1 square mile of Manhattan. And for this, one of the pretty obvious reasons for this, is that 80% of the island is covered by ice. So Greenland is about as wild as you can get these days, I think, and I traveled up to the very wildest part of it, a research station on the top of the ice. It's on the very top of the ice sheet at about 11,000 feet in the middle of the ice sheet. And this is basically what the view is from that research station. It's just white in every direction for hundreds of miles. And if you look closely at the snow, there are these interesting erosional features called sastrugi, which are really very beautiful, but that's really about it. Fridtjof Nansen, who's the Norwegian explorer who in the 1880s led the first team to cross Greenland on skis, recalled the ice sheet's monotony, an interminable flat desert of snow. There was, he complained, no break or change in our horizon, no object to rest the eye upon, and no point by which to direct the compass. The center of the Greenland ice sheet is a really inhuman landscape. In fact, the whole ice sheet is a really inhuman landscape. And except for a couple of research stations like the one I visited, there's really no sign of humanity on the ice sheet, as I say, for many, many thousands of square miles. But of course, it is hard to get away from ourselves these days. So even at the center of the Greenland ice sheet, you're not really isolated anymore. We are there. We have altered the ice. If you dig down in the ice, you find residues of all civilizations that have existed. You find lead from Roman smelters. The Romans did a lot of lead smelting, and some people even argue that lead poisoning is what led to the fall of the Roman Empire. There's plutonium from the nuclear explosions and tests of the 1940s and 50s and 60s, and there's radioactive iodine from the Chernobyl disaster of 1986. And the ice also contains a very detailed record of the way that we've transformed the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels. So all the ice sheet is layers and layers of snow that have built up over, in the case of Greenland, 100,000 years and never melted. And in each layer, there are little bubbles of trapped air. So if you analyze those bubbles, you can see exactly when the Industrial Revolution began and atmospheric CO2 levels started to rise. And you can also see the beginnings of what's been called the Great Acceleration. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this chart, the period that began right after World War II, when consumption of fossil fuels and really all forms of consumption really took off on this exponential growth curve. And a lot of the CO2 that's in the Greenland ice sheet was produced right here in the US, a lot of it right here in New York. And of course, the CO2 that isn't trapped in the ice, the CO2 that's been building up in our atmosphere is now heating the planet and melting the Greenland ice. The ice sheet has lost roughly 6 trillion tons of ice over the last 40 years, and this translates into enough water to cover the eastern seaboard to a depth of 20 feet. And a lot of the sea level rise, Greenland is the single biggest contributor to sea level rise besides just the thermal expansion of water. So water, as it gets warmer, takes up more space. So the sea level rise, you're seeing here in the forever wild areas, a lot of that is being generated by melt off the Greenland ice sheet. So in this way, we truly all are connected. So officially, as you know, we live in the Holocene, which is the period that began at the end of the last ice age, some 12,000 years ago, when New York was under ice. And as you probably know, a group of geologists recently attempted to put an end to the Holocene to declare us in a new period, the Anthropocene. And that, the argument for the Anthropocene is pretty simple, and that is just that there is a new geological force on our planet, which happens to be us. And that in a formal sense, that effort failed. You may have read about that as well. Stratigraphers, this was the group that had to rule on this, they turned out to be a pretty conservative bunch. But informally, we definitely have entered the Anthropocene, the age of human impacts. And there are many pieces of evidence I could adduce for this, many ways in which humans have become the dominant force on the planet, and I'm just going to give you a sampling. So we have transformed more than half of the ice-free land on Earth. That's about 70 million square kilometers. We've done this in all the ways you see here, by building cities and suburbs and reservoirs, and by cutting down forests and planting monocultures. And we've probably transformed about half of what's left by running in pipes, oil pipes, and seismic lines and logging roads. We have dammed or diverted most of the world's major rivers. We now cause more soil erosion than all natural processes combined. In our fertilizer plants, we fix as much nitrogen as all terrestrial ecosystems combined. Humans now outweigh wild mammals, all wild mammals, by a factor of 9 to 1. And if you add in our mammalian livestock, which is mostly cows and pigs, the ratio climbs to 24 to 1. So humans and our livestock outweigh wild mammals 24 to 1. And here, of course, we are transforming the climate, which in turn is melting the world's ice sheet, altering its coastlines, and even changing the tilt of the Earth's axis. So in the age of man, there is nowhere, really nowhere you can go where you will not find evidence of human impacts. When they took a Japanese submersible to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, to a depth of more than 10,000 meters, the deepest part of the Pacific Ocean, they found plastic debris. So this is the backdrop for all conversations about conservation, about nature, about wildness these days. In the Anthropocene, is there really any place that's wild anymore? In a strict sense of wildness, I think we would have to say no. The Greenland ice sheet is, in a certain sense, now even under human control. And the paradox of this is that if we want to keep things the way they are, we need to take active steps. Wildness now has to be managed. as you all know. In places like the Amazon, where there are still big intact pieces of forest, management involves trying to keep loggers and prospectors and gold miners out, something that has proved to be extremely difficult. In landscapes that are more fragmented and disturbed, management can and does take many forms, once again, as you all know. And as you all know, management is hard. It's expensive and difficult and uncertain. Many forms of management bring with them their own problems. Should you introduce a new species to deal with an invasive species? Should you use poisons or traps or even genetic engineering? And questions like these were the subject of my last book, which I called Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future. And I looked at a variety of ways that people were trying to conserve a place or a species or an entire ecosystem that also involved having to change it. And since I'm a journalist, I picked examples that were somewhat quirky and out of the ordinary. But I think they are, in their own way, also exemplary. And since what journalists are trained to do, really all we're trained to do, is tell stories, I'm just going to briefly tell two of those stories this morning. So this is the world's rarest fish. It's the devil's hole pupfish. It's a very beautiful little fish. They're very little, maybe only about an inch long. They're down to a few hundred individuals. And they live only in one freshwater pool in the middle of the Mojave Desert. And in the 1960s, an alfalfa farmer sunk a well not far from Devil's Hole, and the water level in the pool started to drop. And with that, the number of fish started to drop. And so began this remarkable effort to manipulate the environment to save this fish. So this is what Devil's Hole looks like today, with a lot of monitoring equipment in there. It's at the bottom of this little canyon, which means it's often shaded. It's completely now cut off from, you're not allowed to visit it. I managed to get in, with a group of national park officials. It also has this sort of shelf, that slightly lighter area that you see there. You can just barely sort of make it out in that picture. And that's where the fish breed, on this shallow shelf. The rest of the pool is very deep. It's connected to this huge underground aquifer. It's so deep, in fact, no one knows how deep it is. There are actually people who tried to dive to the bottom and never made it back up again and are still there. Yeah. So anyway, as the water level, as they started to pump water, the shelf, this shallow shelf, its area started to decline. And so at one point, some biologists from the University of Nevada rigged up a fake shelf made out of styrofoam to try to help the fish. And the fake shelf was shadier than the real shelf had been, so the National Park Service installed a huge bank of lights at a certain point. Then Fish and Wildlife began delivering supplementary food, and this continues to this day, Grubhub for fish. So sadly, none of these efforts stopped the number of fish from declining. And I should also mention, because this is relevant to you all, this is a listed fish. So in 2006, Fish and Wildlife decided to build an entirely new habitat for the Devil's Hole pupfish, one that would imitate the real one as closely as possible. So now, about a mile away from the real canyon, there is this fake canyon. It took a long time to construct. It didn't open until 2013. And this is what it looks like today, roughly. So the walls of this canyon have been contoured, with 3D printing to replicate the contours of the canyon as closely as possible. And the fiberglass shelf is as closely as possible replicates the shelf of the original. There's this louvered ceiling that is programmed so that the amount of sunlight hitting the pool mimics the amount hitting Devil's Hole, on that very day. Not just the pupfish, obviously, but the whole Devil's Hole ecosystem, or what the elements of it that could be identified, these all had to be transferred to this pool. And if something is off, so it's monitored continuously, temperature, oxygen, blah, blah, blah. If something is off, someone gets a call and has to drive out to this place, which is 45 minutes from the nearest town, sometimes in the middle of the night. So when I visited a couple years ago, the total population in this pool was 50 fish. And there were 4 full-time employees of this facility. So that's about 13 one-inch fish per person. So this next story also involves a fish, or really 4 fish. Doubtless you have all heard about Asian carp. They are often spoken of as if they were a single species. In fact, they're 4 species. So we have silver carp, grass carp, black carp, and big-headed carp, and they all have different diets. And in one of the many tragic ironies of the Anthropocene, these fish were all imported to the US as a conservation measure. They were supposed to solve various problems without the use of chemicals. For instance, grass carp, they're herbivores, and they were supposed to eat aquatic weeds, many of which were also invasive, are also invasive, so that you didn't have to dump herbicides, into lakes. This was exactly what Rachel Carson had. This was in the wake of Silent Spring. It's exactly what Rachel Carson advocates in the last chapter of Silent Spring. If you've read your Silent Spring recently, the road not taken, biocontrol. We should use one creature to fight another creature that we don't like. And biological control has come, in fact, as you know, to play a key role in a lot of contemporary conservation efforts. For example, pretty recently, just in the last few years, 3 different parasitic wasps have been imported to the US from Europe and Asia to fight emerald ash borer, which is killing all of our ash trees here in the Northeast. But in the case of Asian carp, so I am not issuing a sort of blanket warning about biological control, but I am telling you that in the case of Asian carp, things did not work too well. The carp turned out to be very adaptable and extremely voracious. And all these species, which were first introduced into test ponds in the Southeast, got loose very quickly and spread throughout the Mississippi watershed. They have completely taken over large stretches of the rivers. Yeah, so these are silver carp, which are big jumpers. They love to jump. And this has caused a lot of consternation. They are working their way up the Mississippi system toward the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes are already, once again, as you probably know, heavily invaded, especially since the construction of the St. Lawrence Seaway in the 1950s. So this is just, the latest count, and it goes up all the time, 184 invasives established in the Great Lakes. But even in this very heavily invaded ecosystem, there's fear that Asian carp could really wreak havoc. So one other point that's important to this story before I go on is that the Great Lakes actually should not be accessible from the Mississippi watershed. These are 2 separate drainage basins, or at least they have been since the end of the last ice age, up until the early 20th century. But then Chicago undertook this remarkable engineering project to preserve its water supply. So Chicago drinks from Lake Michigan, it still drinks from Lake Michigan, and at the beginning of the 20th century, it was dumping its sewage into Lake Michigan. Not a good idea. And this had exactly the consequences you would think, a lot of waterborne disease. So the city fathers, we'll call them fathers, I'm sure they were all fathers at that point, decided on a great plan. They were going to reverse the flow of the Chicago River, which is the river that flows directly through the center of Chicago. So instead of flowing into Lake Michigan, it was now going to flow out of Lake Michigan into the Des Plaines River, which flows into the Illinois River, which flows into the Mississippi. And this engineering project produced what's known as the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, and it connected those 2 drainage basins. So it now is possible for those 2 systems to exchange species. And this chart just shows you before and after what happened to the waterways, how people really completely reconfigured the hydrology of this whole area. So how to stop the Asian carp now that there's an opening between the Mississippi and the Great Lakes? Well, if you are fortunate enough to take a boat down the Sanitary and Ship Canal, and not many people do that, I have to say, because it's a very heavily, a lot of barge traffic, and basically Chicago's big sewage treatment plant is located on this canal. So it's not considered a scenic place to go. But if you do it, as I was fortunate enough to do, you reach these signs. And they warn you to keep out of the water. Don't go into the water because you'll get electrocuted. And I was told by people who are pretty knowledgeable that this is actually, not hype. If you did dive in, you could potentially kill yourself because there is a lot of electricity being pulsed through this water. And the idea is that when an Asian carp is moving through this electric field, it will experience a shock, basically at its nose, because there's a difference in the electric field there, and it will be convinced, instead of going towards that pain, to turn around and go back. And the electric barrier has been operational for about 20 years now, but Asian carp have a habit of showing up north of this barrier, which always makes a lot of news out in the Midwest. So now the Army Corps of Engineers is planning to build a bigger, better barrier. This one is going to use not just electricity, it's going to also have bubbles and noise to try to dissuade the carp from continuing north. One engineer described this to me as a disco barrier. And the entire project is expected to cost about $1 billion. And this project is moving forward. It just about 2 months ago cleared the last hurdle, which, as you can imagine, involved money. So it is moving forward. That $1 billion project will almost certainly get built now. So I'm just going to tell very quickly one more story. I think I said two, but actually here's one more very quickly. These machines here, these that look like air conditioners, they're what's known as direct air capture units. They pull CO2 out of the air. They work like this. They take air, not like necessarily in this room, which we've breathed out a lot of carbon dioxide, but what's outside. They just suck it in through those vents. And then there are chemicals inside there, and when the chemicals are saturated with CO2, they get heated, the CO2 is forced off, and then it is collected and pumped very deep underground. And this is in Iceland. We are now in Iceland, and because of the geology of Iceland, the whole country is made up of this volcanic rock, very deep underground. The CO2, under a lot of pressure and where there's a lot of heat, it reacts and to become calcium carbonate, basically limestone. And as a proof of concept, they drilled this core to show that, in fact, you were getting calcium carbonate forming, that white stuff in the veins of these rocks. So, most climate scientists agree that if we have not already reached a dangerous level of warming, we are going to do so very soon. And direct air capture of CO2 would allow us, in theory at least, to overshoot our climate goals, 1.5 degrees C. Certainly we are going to overshoot that, and then pull CO2 out of the air to once again, in theory at least, get back to safer levels. And this setup in Iceland is already removing a lot of CO2 from the air. It's removing it at the rate of about 4,000 tons a year. And this is impressive, at least until you measure it against current global emissions, which are roughly 40 billion tons of CO2 a year. So roughly speaking, this project is getting rid of 10 millionth of the CO2 we're putting up there every year. So this gives you a sense of the scale of the challenge. And all of these stories have the same basic point. People have intervened in nature, either purposely or by accident. We've discovered that we don't like the effects of those interventions, or at least not all of them. And now we feel compelled to intervene again. First you reverse a river, then you electrify it. First you pump CO2 into the atmosphere, and then you try to get it back out again. And as I said earlier, the examples that I chose, these were all in the book, they were picked to be provocative, and I am not saying that every effort to manage a natural system fails. But natural systems are extremely complicated, and human systems are extremely complicated, and certainly not every effort succeeds. And the bigger the problem is, I'm afraid, the less likely these second-order interventions are going to be to bring us back to where we want to get. Now, is there an alternative to all this? It certainly would be nice to think so, and it is pretty depressing to think that there's no way back. But this is, I'm afraid, where we are. In the Anthropocene, we are so mixed up in nature that we are obliged to manage it. There's no going back that isn't also going forward. And so I do want to end on a celebratory note. You have been successful here in New York in managing and restoring many of these areas. It's the success of the Forever Wild program that's being honored today. And these are places that I just chose as random, that if New York City parks had not stepped in, I'm sure would not look the way they look right now. And local achievements like this, I think, are hugely important and deserving of being celebrated, at the very least, to show what is possible. And I'm going to end by saying I think that we need to worry globally, but we also need to act and hope locally. So thank you very much.